Hello and welcome. Tonight we journey not into a palace, nor down a marble hall. We won't be sipping wine with kings or pondering the stars beside ancient scholars. No, tonight we begin somewhere humbler and muddier. Between the winding rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, where the reeds hum with wind and the air smells faintly of onions and effort, lies the land of ancient Mesopotamia, a place often referred to as the cradle of civilization, and also, occasionally, the cradle of civil back pain, bureaucratic misery, and more baked mud than is probably healthy for anyone. Now, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you like my content. Your support truly means a lot to me. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm genuinely interested in knowing who is joining us from around the world. Mesopotamia, the name means land between rivers. That's because it is, in fact, between two rivers. No mystery there. But what those rivers gave in water, they took away in the form of unexpected floods, thick mud, and the constant need to build, rebuild, and occasionally panic. Still, those rivers were a gift. They allowed the people of Sumer, and later Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria to do something rather bold for the ancient world. Settle down and invent everything. Writing, math, taxation, architecture, astronomy, legal systems, all invented right here. Not bad for a civilization that didn't have iron tools, deodorant, or anything resembling a weekend. Of course, all that innovation came with a price. For every scribal breakthrough or monumental ziggurat rising into the dusty sky, there were hundreds of ordinary people. Farmers, merchants, potters, weavers, laborers, herders, fishers, living their lives not in the glory of history books, but in the dry heat, the cracked earth, and the reality of needing to feed their family on 5 onions and a hope. Imagine the scene. You're not in a lush garden. Eden was probably real estate propaganda. You're in a sun-dried mud brick home, maybe 2 rooms, with walls that crack under too much sun and leak under too much rain. The roof is flat and occasionally used as a place to sleep when the indoor heat becomes unbearable. Your neighbors are close, your goat is closer, and privacy is mostly a rumor told by the wind. The city is nearby, maybe maybe Uruk. You've heard of Babylon, but that's just a name on a trader's lips. Right now, your world is much smaller. A home, a market, a field, a temple, and that one smug scribe who always seems to know how much barley you owe. The streets are dusty, crowded, and vaguely aromatic. There's music somewhere, played on a lyre that's slightly out of tune. A child runs past holding what looks like half a fish. No one asks where the other half went. If you're lucky, you're not waking up on the palace steps or inside a debtor's cell. You're just ordinary. But in Mesopotamia, even ordinary could feel like a full-time job. And spoiler alert, it was. Civilization, it turns out, involves a lot of forms. And those forms are written in clay, with sticks. And if your name ends up on the wrong one, good luck explaining anything to a priest judge wearing more eyeliner than seems appropriate for the legal profession. But tonight, we aren't reading the tablets. We're living among the people whose lives were rarely recorded. The people who made the bread, built the walls, fetched the water, and tried, really, truly tried, not to offend any gods, neighbors, or wandering scribes. We'll walk through their morning routines, their work in the fields and the shops, their rituals, diets, frustrations and joys. Because while Mesopotamia is often painted as a place of rulers and gods, empires and laws, it was also a place full of tired feet, itchy tunics, and the universal human experience of trying to get through the day without getting yelled at. Tonight, our guide isn't Hammurabi or Gilgamesh. It's not Inanna or Ishtar. Tonight, we drift into sleep through the eyes of someone with no epic tale written in cuneiform. Just a life. One lived between taxes and temple festivals, between goat herding and grain pounding, between the hot sun and the sticky mud. A life where survival was an accomplishment and rest, real rest, was the rarest treasure of all. So now, close your eyes, if they haven't already fluttered shut. The ziggurats loom in the distance, tall and crumbling. The rivers flow nearby, murmuring softly to the reeds. A pot cracks somewhere. Someone shouts about barley, but none of that is your concern. You're here, among the first to be civilized, and that means you're among the first to be overwhelmed by it. Let's begin our day in ancient Mesopotamia. But we won't rush. No, there's no haste in history. Just soft footsteps, quiet whispers, and the knowledge that everything we now call advanced started with people who just wanted a decent meal, a working roof, and maybe someday a bed that didn't smell like sheep. Our story starts not in a palace, not in a temple, but in a home. Small, dusty, warm. A home with reed mats, a shared sleeping space, and the distinct feeling that it's already too hot outside. Someone's stirring the grain mush over a fire. Someone else is already fetching water. And you, well, you're about to open your eyes, but maybe not just yet. The sun hasn't crested the horizon. The roosters are still deciding whether to start the day, and you, poor Mesopotamian friend, have a long, dry, sun-baked road ahead. So rest if you'd like, or stretch into the day slowly with us. There's no hurry. We've got an empire's worth of chores to get through. And now, let's open our eyes in a mud-walled home somewhere in Sumer, where the floor is made of hard-packed earth, and the bed is mostly straw and stubbornness. It's time to wake up in ancient Mesopotamia. The day begins before the sun does. Not because you're ambitious. Ambition requires options. But because the chickens do. Or maybe it's the goat. Or the neighbor yelling about his missing sandals again. Either way, the world starts moving, and so must you. Welcome to a new day in the dusty embrace of Mesopotamia. You live in what they call a wattle and daub house, which sounds charming until you realize it just means walls made of woven sticks coated in mud. Mud that cracks in the heat, leaks in the rain, and falls off when your cousin brushes against it too hard. This home is shared, very shared. You, your parents, your siblings, a stray cat, and possibly a few small livestock are all packed into 2 rooms and a prayer. Privacy is theoretical. Someone snores loudly, someone else mutters in their sleep, and someone, you're pretty sure it's Uncle Ernagle, smells faintly of turnips and goat. Your bed is a reed mat on a hard floor. Your blanket is another mat. Pillows are for nobles and dreams. You're already itchy. The air is thick with smoke from last night's cookfire, and someone stepped on a clay bowl during the night. It's shattered, of course. Everything breaks easily when it's sun-baked. Your foot, your patience, and especially the few things you own. Outside the city, maybe Uruk, maybe Lagash, stirs. The sound of hooves, shouts, and wooden wheels bumping over cobbles begins to rise like the sun. Of vendors already yelling about dates. Or debts, possibly both. You stretch, sort of. The ceiling is low, the air still, and someone has already knocked over the water jug. Again, your clothes are simple, a tunic of rough woven wool or flax, scratchy, faded and slightly damp. Socks aren't a thing, but sandals are, if you're lucky. If you're not, it's barefoot again through the grit and goat droppings. Someone once tried to fashion foot wraps out of palm fiber. They still walk with a limp. The fashion of the day is survival, accessorized with a smear of ash and an expression of resigned irritation. For breakfast, you get a handful of crushed barley, uncooked, maybe soaked if someone remembered, and a wedge of onion so strong it could serve as pest control. If it's a good day, there might be some dried figs or yesterday's beer. Mesopotamian beer is, let's call it chunky. It's made from bread, water, and the desire to forget what you're drinking. Filtered through a straw, because chewing your drink is apparently frowned upon. And the sand. There's always sand. In the food, in your hair, between your toes, in places you didn't think sand could go. It's the seasoning of civilization, the scent of the room, smoke, onions, damp wool, and whatever the sheep dragged in. You've grown used to it. It's the background perfume of the entire Tigris-Euphrates region. Fancy people burn incense. You burn breakfast. Already sweat trickles down your back. The sun isn't even fully up, but the heat has arrived early, uninvited, unrelenting, and uninterested in your plans. You wipe your face with the least dirty part of your tunic, then immediately regret it. Outside, the street is alive. Children run past with slingshots. Merchants shout about fish, bread, or the fish-bread combo no one asked for. A goat bleats angrily at a clay wall. You check your list of tasks. Not a real list. You can't write. But the mental list never leaves. Today, you need to collect water, sweep the front step, help patch the wall, grind grain, and if time allows, not collapse. If you're a farmer, the fields call. If you're a potter, the kiln's already smoking. If you're a priest's assistant, may the gods have mercy. Temples mean ritual cleaning, moving statues, and staying awake during hours of chanting about things you don't understand. If you're particularly unlucky, someone will assign you to clay tablet duty, which is basically data entry with a sharp stick and no coffee. Interesting fact, Mesopotamian writing, cuneiform, was created by pressing a reed stylus into wet clay. Beautiful, yes. Fun? Not at all. And those tablets were everywhere. Receipts, contracts, tax records, love poems, all etched into bricks and baked into eternity. Break one, and you're in trouble. Misspell a word, and it's not like you can erase. You just make another one, slowly, carefully, while your back reminds you that chairs haven't been invented yet. You hear a shout. Someone's ox wandered into the neighbor's barley again. There's a minor scuffle. A jug is thrown. No one is surprised. Conflict resolution in Mesopotamia ranges from shouting to extensive litigation involving temple officials and goats. But that's for later. Right now, you step out into the street, breathing in the thick aroma of effort, commerce, and roasted legumes. A passing scribe nods to you. You nod back, then immediately check to make sure you're not on his debt list. Mesopotamian cities were planned, kind of. Streets twist and turn. Buildings crowd each other. And if you're not careful, you'll walk into a sacred courtyard and get yelled at by a priest in eyeliner. You pass a statue of a god. Tall, serene, possibly annoyed. You bow slightly. Better safe than sorry. The gods are everywhere, and they're not known for their patience. Especially if you step on one of their temple cats. It's still early, but the noise, the dust, and the responsibilities have already stacked themselves high above your head. And the day has just begun. So where to now? The field, the shop, the canal, or maybe the ziggurat needs sweeping again. Regardless, your legs are moving, your hands are busy, and your stomach is already asking about lunch, which it won't enjoy. Welcome to Mesopotamia, where your dawn comes early, your tunic stays damp, and your best hope is that the goat doesn't escape again. And now, as you hoist a clay jug over your shoulder and begin walking toward the edge of the city, dodging puddles, pigs, and problems, you know this day, like all others, will be long, loud, and loaded with tiny tragedies. But that's civilization. You helped build it. You just wish it came with breakfast options. Let's keep walking. There's grain to grind and a temple to avoid. The workday is just beginning. The sun's already halfway to its daily peak, and you've been working since the sky was still blushing. Welcome to your life as a Mesopotamian farmer, the noblest profession according to some clay tablet, probably written by someone who never touched a shovel. Your field is not a sweeping sea of golden grain. No, it's mud. Squelchy, cling to your sandals, ruin your weak mud. Because you don't just farm the land, you farm because of the water, and despite it. That's irrigation. It sounds neat in textbooks, but here it means digging ditches with tools that haven't changed since someone figured out what a stick is good for. Mesopotamia is called the cradle of civilization, which feels a bit ironic while your spine cracks like a dry reed. You're standing between the Tigris and the Euphrates, but you don't feel cradled. You feel damp, and not in a relaxing spa way. It's more of a trudging knee-deep in silt and regret situation. The Sumerians were geniuses in irrigation, sure. They created levees, canals, and basins to harness the river's seasonal floods, which sounds lovely until you realize you're the one who maintains them. And if you don't, well, too much water drowns your crops. Too little, they shrivel into expensive straw. Mesopotamian agriculture is basically a daily conversation with nature, and she doesn't speak your dialect. You grip a wooden hoe, worn smooth from generations of tired hands, and begin another row. Planting barley again, because that's what the gods and the taxman both like. It's dependable, it's drinkable, and it survives the moods of the rivers. Sometimes. You look up at the sky, which offers no answers. Just heat. The soil is rich, but that doesn't mean your life is. Blisters form fast, and the reeds near the canal always seem eager to slice your ankles. Your sandals gave up an hour ago. One of the sheep is stuck again, and you have to rescue it before it drowns itself in 2 inches of water. You mutter a prayer to whichever god is in charge of wool-brained livestock, possibly Dumuzi, possibly Enki, possibly just the ghost of your uncle. And about those gods, they're everywhere, watching, judging. You've probably offended at least 3 today already by cursing your luck or stepping on a sacred worm. Life on the floodplain is divine adjacent, but not divinely pleasant. You're never quite sure if the flood is a punishment or a reward. Your calendar is based on planting and harvesting cycles, which means it is built entirely around stress. Did it rain too much this month? Did the locusts come back? Did your neighbor's goat eat your boundary markers again? The stars say this month is auspicious for planting, but your back says it's suspicious for walking. Interesting fact. Early Mesopotamian plows needed 2 people, one to steer, the other to pull. And if you didn't own oxen, guess who was the oxen? That's right. It's a 2-person job with a 1-human budget. You once tried to bribe a cousin into helping with figs, but he only made it halfway before collapsing dramatically in a patch of lentils. You wipe sweat from your brow with the back of your hand, now caked with a mix of dust and what you sincerely hope is just more dust. You'd like to rest, but there's more to do. The canal is leaking again. The boundary between your plot and your neighbors is somehow mysteriously moving. And a priest just walked by, eyeing your barley like it's already on the offering table. Because farming isn't just planting and harvesting. It's also paying. Taxes, tithes, tributes. The king wants grain. The temple wants grain. Your landlord, whose grandfather conquered this village, definitely wants grain. You want grain, too, to eat. But that's not how this works. You'll be lucky if you keep 1/3 of what you grow. Even with your careful tally of sacks and estimates, someone always claims you miscounted. The official tax scribe never seems to miscount in your favor. And if you argue, well, the tablet says you owe it, so that's the end of that. You glance toward the ziggurat on the horizon, a towering mud brick monument to the gods, built with the sweat of many farmers and the vision of a priest who definitely didn't haul any bricks himself. The top of the ziggurat reaches toward the heavens. Your back reaches for the nearest pile of reeds to lie down in. But there's no rest yet. The barley still needs bundling, and the ox, who's been glaring at you all morning, seems poised for rebellion. You're almost certain it understands sarcasm. A cart rattles past on the nearby path, its wheels threatening to fling clay at your freshly planted row. The driver calls a half-hearted apology. You sigh. There is no workers' union in Sumer. There are no breaks, no weekends. Just a series of tasks strung together by hope and sore muscles. Still, you endure. Because you must. Because this is your field, your family's land. Or at least you tell yourself that, even though it's technically owned by a noble who hasn't been here since the last lunar eclipse. As the sun begins its slow descent, you finally finish your row. Your arms ache, your knees crunch, but it's done. You pack your tools, which is really just stacking them under a tree and hoping no one takes them, and begin the walk home. The air smells like burnt reeds and old onions. The children are chasing each other with sticks, and someone is shouting about beer again. Your reward for the day's labor? Not much. Some food, a few hours of sleep, and the promise of doing it all again tomorrow. But before that, you must visit the scribe. It's time to report your crop estimates and pay your dues. So, brush the mud from your tunic, steel yourself against the bureaucracy, and remember, the flood always comes, and so do the tax collectors. Now, let's head to town, where the ink dries faster than the sweat on your brow, and no one forgets a debt, especially not in clay. It's late afternoon in ancient Mesopotamia, and while your body wants to collapse into the nearest puddle of barley chaff, your next destination is far less relaxing. You're going to the temple, not for spiritual enlightenment, but for something far more terrifying. Taxes. The temple looms ahead, its massive mud brick facade cracking in the sun like old parchment. It's not just a place of worship. It's the bank, the town hall, the tax office, and occasionally the public complaints department, though complaints are not particularly welcomed. Inside, it smells like incense, wet clay, and faint despair. Somewhere, a goat bleats. It might be yours. It might be next month's tax. The temple scribes are already waiting. They always are. Perched behind their low wooden desks, they don't look like priests or holy men. They look like people who take clay very seriously. One stares at you over a waxed mustache, stylus twitching like it's eager to strike. His robe is too clean, his hands too dry. You already feel judged. Taxes in Mesopotamia aren't a once-a-year annoyance. They're a lifestyle. Everything is taxable. Crops? Of course. Animals? Naturally. Tools, pottery, shoes, fish, haircuts, even the reeds you gathered for your roof. If it exists, they can tax it. If it doesn't exist, they might still try. You step forward with a sack of barley, a small jug of something alcoholic, which you may or may not admit is mostly rainwater, and the vague hope that maybe this time the clay tablet will show mercy. It does not. The scribe picks up his stylus, a pointed reed stick used to press little wedge-shaped symbols, cuneiform, into a fresh slab of moist clay. You cannot read cuneiform. Most people can't. It's one of the earliest writing systems, invented right here in this cradle of scribbled civilization. To you, it looks like someone angrily poked a cookie. The scribe doesn't explain what he's writing. He just looks at your sack, grunts, and scribbles something that might translate to short again. You try to protest, but he raises one eyebrow. And you remember what happened last time someone questioned a tax amount. They ended up doing community service in the Fish Gut district. You nod instead. Interesting fact? Temple scribes were among the most educated people in the land. They spent years learning the hundreds of symbols in the cuneiform system. They were trained in math, law, and the subtle art of looking unimpressed. Being a scribe was prestigious, unless of course you were on the other side of the desk. You hand over your offerings, not coins, those aren't common yet. Most payments are made in kind. Grain, oil, goats, and occasionally family heirlooms. That clay lamp your grandmother gave you, it now belongs to the administrative deity of barley reconciliation. The clay tablet is pressed, sealed, and stored in the temple archives, where it will sit next to thousands of others, each one detailing someone's small, dusty struggle to stay afloat. No one reads them again unless there's a dispute, or unless, thousands of years later, an archaeologist finds one and decides it would make a great museum label. Outside, another line is forming. Farmers, fishermen, potters, shepherds, everyone owes something. One man has brought chickens. The chickens are unimpressed. One peasant is trying to explain a crop failure to a scribe who looks like he hasn't seen a field in his life. There is shouting. The clay is recording. There's no actual money to speak of, not in the way you'd think. Barter is king. One donkey might be worth 3 baskets of fish or a decent roof repair. Unless, of course, the scribe says otherwise. Then the donkey is somehow worth exactly what the temple needs for a new incense burner. You try not to think too hard about the system. Taxes go to the king, and to the temple, and to the local officials. The scribes swear it's all fair, written on the tablets after all. But you have your doubts. You once saw a priest ride a litter past your field, eating dates and shouting for someone to fan him. That someone turned out to be your cousin. Back home, you'll have less barley to eat, less oil to cook with, and significantly less patience. But you'll have a receipt, a clay tablet, stamped with the seal of a minor god, certifying that you are, for the moment, in good standing. Unless the scribe made a mistake, or didn't like your face, or just felt like writing underpayment because his lunch was late, you tuck the tablet carefully into a woven pouch and prepare to leave. Behind you, the scribes continue scratching into clay, their hands swift, their eyes sharp, their hearts perhaps slightly calcified. The sun has dipped low, casting the temple in golden light. Beautiful, yes. Expensive, definitely. You paid for some of those bricks after all, and still you whisper a prayer. Not for wealth, not even for rain, just for the taxman to forget you next season. Let's leave the temple now. Our obligations pressed neatly into tablets, our dignity slightly thinner, and our clay dust allergies in full bloom. The scribes have done their work. Tomorrow, you'll return to the fields, hoping the gods are less demanding than their administrators. But first, let's visit those scribes again, not as taxpayers this time, but as curious onlookers. Because what is it like to spend your life writing in mud? Let's pause for a moment and consider the life of the one person in ancient Mesopotamia who doesn't return home with dirt under their fingernails, blisters on their hands, or goat bites on their ankles. Instead, they come home with sore wrists, ink-stained robes, and a strong opinion about wedge shapes. We're talking, of course, about the scribe. Being a scribe in ancient Mesopotamia is a big deal. Literacy is rare, and most people are far too busy planting barley, dodging taxes, or sweeping temples to learn the fine art of pressing little triangles into damp clay. Scribes are trained professionals, educated in both language and law, and possess the one power everyone respects: the power to document things. Now, to become a scribe is no picnic. You don't just pick up a stylus and start writing love poems. No, you begin your training as a student, a pupil at a tablet house, which sounds like a quaint stationery shop, but is really a stern classroom where the main activity is repetition, and more repetition, followed by even more repetition. Interesting fact, young scribes learned cuneiform by copying proverbs and legal formulas over and over again. One common phrase found on countless training tablets is something like, "Do not talk back to your superior." Some students, bless them, even added notes in the margins that basically say, "I am tired." Relatable. Your day begins early, as with everyone in Mesopotamia. But instead of trudging into the fields or gathering reeds, you sit hunched over a small slab of clay, stylus in hand, as a teacher with a long memory and short patience watches closely. There's no chalkboard, there are no books. There's just you, the stylus, the clay, and your aching fingers. The stylus itself is often made of reed, with a triangular tip that makes the distinctive wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform. Each mark represents a sound, a word, or an entire idea, depending on how it's arranged. The system is complex, hundreds of signs, subtle variations, and lots of opportunities to mess up. If you think typing ter instead of the is annoying, try smudging a clay tablet 2 hours into transcribing your landlord's goat lease agreement. Once trained, scribes enjoy a position of prestige, or at least as much prestige as one can enjoy in a city where people still think bathing once a month is excessive. You're employed by temples, palaces, merchants, or even the local brewer who needs someone to keep track of who owes what in hops and barley. Contracts, receipts, legal disputes, ration lists, everything goes through the scribe. Which means, in a way, scribes are ancient Mesopotamia's version of a bureaucratic octopus. One hand in everything. You want to sell your donkey? Get a scribe. You need to write a letter to your cousin in Akkad? Get a scribe. You're worried your neighbor trespassed on your grain pile? Definitely get a scribe. Now, contrary to what you might think, being literate doesn't mean you get to write poetry under a fig tree all day. Most scribes spend their lives bent over clay, pressing, checking, and occasionally swearing when the dog steps on a finished document. The work is physically demanding in its own way. The tablets are heavy, the posture is terrible, and the storage system is, let's be honest, just piles of brittle rectangles stacked in corners. Still, there are perks. People respect you. Sort of. They nod to you in the street. They speak to you cautiously when you're calculating how much barley they actually owe, and they occasionally slip you an extra fish to make that fine look more like a suggestion. You attend temple events. You might get invited to palace feasts, at the back table, but still. And most importantly, you get to sit down while you work. That's worth its weight in bronze. Some scribes become scholars, delving into astronomy, medicine, and omens. Others drift into government work, keeping royal archives, or recording the king's dream about fighting a lion with 7 heads. Some even serve as judges, interpreting not just the law, but the will of the gods through coded tablets and odd dreams. But the average scribe, he's a professional clay presser with a mild hunch and strong opinions about proper stylus grip. His daily grind involves a lot of, "No, you can't pay your tax in fish heads," and "Yes, the fine says immediate." He's the backbone of civilization, and also the reason you know how many goats a man named Ur-Nammu traded for a house made of reeds in 2150 BCE. Of course, there's always pressure. If you mess up, say you forget a line in a contract or accidentally record a sheep as a cow, there are consequences. At best, public embarrassment. At worst, someone accuses you of corrupt accounting, and then it's off to sweep temple floors until your hands are as clean as your conscience. Still, for most scribes, it's worth it. Better sore hands than sore backs, better ink stains than blisters, and better a small clay desk than a large plough. As evening falls, the scribe finishes his final tablet, gently pressing his signature mark into the soft surface with a carved seal, proof of authorship and protection against future accusations of forgery. He places it on a drying shelf, stretches his arms, and sighs. Outside, the city buzzes with noise, markets closing, animals complaining, children throwing date pits at each other. Inside, it's quiet, dusty, and smells like old onions and wet clay. Now let's leave the scribe to his rest. He's earned it. And besides, we've spent enough time in the administrative heart of Mesopotamia. Let's step out into the streets, follow the clamor of voices and hooves, and explore the markets, where the smell is equal parts excitement and questionable fish. Let's step out of the clay-covered quiet of the scribe's corner and into the heart of the city, where things are louder, smellier, and far more confusing. Welcome to ancient Mesopotamian urban life. Whether you're in Ur, Uruk, Babylon, or one of the many other cities scattered between the Tigris and Euphrates, one thing is certain. There is no such thing as personal space, quiet time, or a fresh breeze. City life in ancient Mesopotamia is bustling, which is a polite way of saying it's chaos with a mud brick face. The streets are narrow and dusty, and there's no such thing as sidewalks. You walk where the ox carts go, and they absolutely do not stop for you. Neither do the sheep, the pigs, the chickens, or that one child with a stick chasing an unfortunate turtle. You learn to step quickly and never assume the puddle is just water. Spoiler, it's not. There's also the scent of civilization. No indoor plumbing means people use pots, ditches, or convenient alleys, and then dump everything into the street. Ur and Babylon are known for their sophistication, their temples, and their achievements. But they're also known for a truly heroic level of communal odor. People wear perfume not to smell nice, but to survive. The buildings are packed close together, 2, sometimes 3 stories high, made of mud bricks, sun-dried to the consistency of soft concrete. They bake in the heat all day, and by night they radiate the warmth like a grumpy oven. If you live on the upper floor, congratulations, you get more breeze and fewer rats. If you live on the bottom floor, you get every neighbour's leftover bathwater, garbage, and opinions. The market is the soul of the city, and by soul, we mean the loudest, pushiest place you'll see today. Vendors shout over each other to sell dates, lentils, dried fish, sandals, sheep wool, copper trinkets, and occasionally a slightly cursed idol. Haggling is expected, required, and exhausting. You don't just ask the price, you pretend to faint, gasp in horror, accuse the merchant of highway robbery, and then settle on something 20% less than what he originally said, which is still probably too much. Interesting fact, Mesopotamian markets included detailed legal rules. Hammurabi's code, yes, that Hammurabi, had laws regulating trade, weights, prices, and merchant conduct. So if your scales were dishonest, the state could legally break them, or worse, break something on you. As you edge your way through the crowd, avoiding flailing elbows and enthusiastic goat salesmen, you're occasionally interrupted by something louder than even the spice vendor, a divine procession. Temples in Mesopotamian cities weren't just places of worship. They were power centers, banks, and event venues all rolled into one. And when a god needed to be carried through the streets, which happened more often than you'd think, everything stopped. Picture this. A group of priests in pointy hats and ceremonial robes, some banging drums, others waving incense, slowly marching behind a statue of a god that's looking vaguely annoyed. People bow, children gawk, and vendors either pause respectfully or try to sell holy amulets at a discount. It's all part of the rhythm of the city, divine interventions, civic celebrations, and the occasional ox that escapes and decides it's time to explore downtown. Ziggurats tower over it all. These massive step pyramids serve as temples to the gods, towering above the rest of the city like ancient apartment buildings made for deities. The most famous, the one in Babylon, was so tall that some believe it inspired the myth of the Tower of Babel. Climbing one is said to bring you closer to the gods, or at least give you a nice breeze at the top. But unless you're a priest, you're not going up there. You're staying at ground level, where the mud is. At street level, you navigate around more than just people. You dodge carts full of reeds, beggars shouting prayers, temple workers trying to move sacred goats, and animals being led to market or sacrifice, or both. The mix of human, divine, and livestock energy is overwhelming. Everyone has somewhere to go, something to sell, or someone to yell at. And then there's the noise. You think your city today is loud? Try Mesopotamia. Merchants yell, children shriek, dogs bark, livestock complain, priests chant, musicians play lyres badly, And all of this bounces off the narrow walls and sun-baked bricks to create what archaeologists would call urban ambience, and what you'd call a headache with no aspirin. But despite the noise and the mud, and the vaguely aggressive poultry, there's a strange rhythm to city life. People know each other. They share food, water, stories, gossip, and occasionally lice. You know the best stall for onions, the worst neighbor for singing, and the exact time the temple bells ring. Community means survival, and even if your walls are made of mud and your sandals are barely holding together, you belong somewhere. Interesting fact: ancient Mesopotamian cities had surprisingly advanced administrative systems. They kept records of sales, births, marriages, and even zoning laws, enforced, of course, by people who thought a fair trial meant consulting an omen and checking the direction of a bird's flight. As the sun climbs higher and the market reaches full roar, your stomach reminds you that breakfast was mostly disappointment and sand. It's time for lunch, if you can find something edible, affordable, and not currently being blessed or bartered. Let's follow the scent of roasting onions, old bread, and slightly fermented date wine and see what's cooking. Because if there's one thing Mesopotamians never truly mastered, it's cuisine without crunch, and we don't mean the good kind. Let's take a deep breath, or try to, over the smell of fish and fermentation, and turn our attention to one of life's unavoidable necessities: food. Not feasts, mind you, not banquets, just the daily practical business of feeding yourself in a place that's one bad flood away from famine. Welcome to the Mesopotamian diet. It's ancient, it's honest, and it's deeply underwhelming. Start with barley. You're going to get very familiar with barley. Barley is the foundation of the Mesopotamian food pyramid. The top, the sides, and most of the remaining structure. You eat it in bread form, drink it in beer form, and sometimes chew it raw when your teeth are feeling bold and you've run out of other ideas. Barley bread is the staple of your diet. It comes in two textures: dense or slightly more dense. Think of it like edible clay, hearty, filling, and occasionally harboring an unexpected pebble. The bread is usually flat, baked in a dome-shaped oven called a tanner, and flavored with either nothing or regret. If you're lucky, maybe a little onion. If you're extra lucky, the onion isn't fermented. But don't count on that. Now wash it down with beer. Yes, beer, but not the kind with bubbles and crisp commercials. Mesopotamian beer is cloudy, warm, and comes with its own internal ecosystem. It's made from fermented barley mash, thick enough to chew, and sometimes still wriggling with sediment. That's why the Mesopotamians invented the straw. Not for sipping mojitos poolside, but to avoid accidentally swallowing the bottom of the barrel. It's clever, really. A humble reed stalk turned ancient lifesaver. Somewhere between a drinking utensil and a survival tool. And you drink it not for fun, but because water isn't always safe. The rivers give life, but they also give parasites. And no one's figured out filtration beyond hope and prayer. Beer, at least, is boiled, fermented, and blessed by whichever local god likes barley best this week. Interesting fact: Mesopotamian beer came in many varieties and was often used as part of worker wages. Laborers on temple projects could receive beer as part of their pay, ensuring that they stayed hydrated, mildly buzzed, and too full of bread paste to protest. For protein, you have fish. Fish from the Euphrates or Tigris, caught with nets, traps, or pure desperation. Fresh fish is a blessing. Spoiled fish is more common. Salted if there's time. Dried if there's sun. Eaten quickly if the smell doesn't make you weep. Meat. Only if an animal dies unexpectedly or it's a festival. Chickens, sheep, and goats are too valuable alive, producing milk, wool, and more small animals. You don't eat pets, unless winter says otherwise. And let's not forget the joy of food storage. Ancient Mesopotamians didn't have fridges or even particularly good jars. Your grain is stored in clay pots, your bread wrapped in reeds or left out, and your beer hopefully consumed before it evolves into a new species. Mold is always around, cheerful, green, and thriving in corners. You scrape it off, or don't. No one's judging. Everyone has stomach aches anyway. Meals are eaten quickly, usually standing, with minimal ceremony. No napkins, no forks, no plates unless you're rich. A flat slab of clay or a woven basket might do. There's no concept of courses. Food appears, You eat it, and it disappears. Your break lasts until someone shouts your name or a goat escapes, whichever comes first. You eat to survive, not to socialize. If someone does try to talk during the meal, they're probably trying to sell you a sick donkey or recruit you for ziggurat duty. Interesting fact: despite the plainness of daily meals, Mesopotamians had complex recipes, at least at the elite level. The oldest known cookbook in the world, written in cuneiform on a clay tablet, contains recipes for stews and meat dishes. But unless you're a palace cook, you're not seeing any of it. Your recipe is bread, onion, water, pray. Dessert? Not unless you count dates. Dates are one of the few sweet things you'll encounter. They grow on trees, actual dates, not social appointments, and provide sugar, texture, and something to look forward to besides your next tax notice. If someone gives you a handful of dates, either they like you or they're apologizing for something. Sometimes there's cheese, usually made from sheep or goat milk. But let's be honest, it's closer to fermented curd than cheddar. It's tangy, chewy, and stored in animal skins. If it doesn't smell like something that could knock you over, it's probably not ready yet. You're not cooking with recipes. You're cooking with fire, instinct, and whatever the market had that day, which might be a slightly bruised turnip or a questionable fish. Spices are rare and expensive. Salt is common but precious. Most flavor comes from hope and heat, and food is never certain. A flood, a war, a bad harvest, or an unlucky priest's omen could mean hunger. Rations are cut, bread is stretched, beer is thinner. Everyone pretends it's fine. You plant again and hope next month doesn't involve famine or frogs or both. As you chew on your slightly stale barley loaf and try not to look directly at the dried fish's eye, you hear the temple bells ringing in the distance. That means work is about to resume. The gods are watching, the scribes are writing, and your stomach is still mostly empty. You lick your fingers, wipe them on your tunic, because you have no napkin, and rise to your feet. Lunch is over. Hunger is not. It's time to head back to the task at hand. Let's walk into the afternoon heat and find out what goes wrong when the river doesn't rise, the crops don't grow, or the king demands a monument built in 3 weeks. Because in Mesopotamia, if you're not tired, you're probably in trouble. Punishment in ancient Mesopotamia was a lot like the region's weather: sudden, harsh, and prone to escalation. The Code of Hammurabi is often touted in textbooks as a marvel of early legal thinking. And it was, in the same way, a flaming chariot is an early form of transportation. Brilliant, yes, but you wouldn't want to ride it to work. The code wasn't so much a gentle reminder to be nice, but a carved warning that if you so much as scratch someone's ox, your own livestock better start running. Let's say you're just a regular farmer in Babylon. You forget to close your granary, and someone sneaks in and steals a few sacks of grain. Not only do you get fined for negligence, the thief, if caught, may lose a hand or be forced into servitude. It depends. Did they have friends in higher places? Did the scribe have a bad day? Was it market day and the judge in a hurry? These things matter. The famous eye for an eye clause wasn't poetic metaphor. It was court procedure. If you broke a man's tooth, yours would be politely removed in return. Accidentally knock over your neighbor's house while building yours. Congratulations. You now owe him a new one, or possibly your own, depending on how sturdy your walls were. The law also recognized different social classes, but not in a modern HR-compliant way. If you, a commoner, harmed a noble, expect harsher punishment than if the roles were reversed. Slaves, of course, were treated to the legal equivalent of "you'll get what's coming, eventually," which usually meant beatings or worse, sometimes simply for talking back. Yes, there was a law about that too. Spoiler, it didn't go in your favor. For those daring enough to steal, say a loaf of bread or a goat, the code had you covered. And by covered, we mean tied up and judged in ways that ranged from bizarre to brutal. Some offenses were settled by oath, swearing by the gods that you didn't do it. Sounds fair, unless the other guy swears louder or has more goats. Others were tried through river ordeal. Throw the accused into the river. If they float, the gods have judged them innocent. If they sink, well, they won't be stealing again. Fun fact, the Mesopotamians really cared about beer. Law number 108 of Hammurabi's code states that if a tavern owner overcharged or watered down beer, they could be punished by, you guessed it, death. Imagine a modern bar having to shut down because the ale was too weak. Babylonian Yelp would have been a wild read. For most people, legal protection was about as reliable as a clay roof in a thunderstorm. If you were wealthy or had connections, the law was a helpful suggestion. If you were poor, it was a looming threat. Enforcement varied widely. Judges were local elders or appointed bureaucrats, some of whom knew the code by heart, and others who, let's be honest, may have just guessed and hoped the clay tablets backed them up later. Also, did we mention everything was recorded in clay? Imagine waiting for your trial and watching your punishment slowly being etched by a frowning scribe who keeps stopping to fix his reed stylus. Justice might be blind, but in Mesopotamia it was also late, dusty, and easily broken if you dropped it. And speaking of those scribes, yes, they're back again. They were the true legal powerhouses, often more influential than the local judge. Why? Because they were the ones who could read, write, and interpret the laws. If your fine was mistakenly doubled because of a squiggly mark on the tablet, well, good luck arguing. Now, punishment was not always physical. Fines were common, paid in grain, silver, or livestock. But for the lower classes, those fines were often impossible to pay, leading to a debt cycle that landed people in slavery. Not exactly the civil justice system most people dream of today. Still, not everything was doom and gloom. Some legal codes tried to regulate wages, rental agreements, even how long someone could borrow a plough. Disputes over farmland, marriage contracts, or livestock grazing rights were hashed out under watchful eyes and baked clay laws. It's just that the hashing out could sometimes mean public humiliation or forced labor. In the end, the laws of Hammurabi offer a fascinating glimpse into early civilization, and a strong case for not forgetting to return your neighbor's ox. For you, though, the system is terrifying. You've seen people punished for things they barely understood. The temple scribes murmur about codes and consequences, while you just want your barley to grow and your neighbor to stop accusing you of stealing chickens. You live in constant quiet fear, not of bandits or wild animals, but of bureaucrats with tablets and bad attitudes. So you nod, you bow, you offer extra barley at the temple, and you pray to gods who may or may not care that you accidentally insulted someone's goat. Now, as the sun starts to dip behind the ziggurat and the smell of evening cookfires fills the dusty air, you retreat to your little house. You haven't committed any crimes that you know of, and you've survived another day without a summons, a whipping, or an unexpected swim. Let's now shift from the courts to the comforts of home, or whatever counts as comfort in ancient Mesopotamia, because family life, well, that's its own kind of legally sanctioned chaos. You wake up before dawn again, not to chase dreams or brew poetry, but because someone small is stepping on your face. It's your youngest child, barefoot, sticky, and wide awake. The mud brick house you share with your extended family is buzzing already. Not with excitement, but with the familiar dread of yet another day of domestic chaos in ancient Mesopotamia. Marriage, you should know, is not a matter of love or spontaneous rooftop serenades. It's a transaction, a strategic alliance between families, where dowries are negotiated with the intensity of a royal treaty. You didn't pick your spouse. Your father did, after checking which neighbors had goats, grain, and passably quiet daughters. Once married, you become the reigning monarch of the home, in title only. Your kingdom includes one dark room, a fire pit, and possibly a goat that refuses to leave. You manage the household economy, rationing barley, organizing chores, and trying to keep your children from wandering off into the Euphrates. If you're lucky and from the right family, you might run a small stall at the market or supervise servants. But mostly, your days revolve around surviving the domestic sphere with grace and only mild resentment. Domestic chores are endless. First, there's grain grinding. You squat on the floor, rocking a heavy stone back and forth over raw barley. It's repetitive, slow, and leaves your hands rougher than a sun-dried brick. This goes on for hours, interrupted only by a baby crying, a pot boiling over, or a neighbor shouting something unprintable over the wall. Then there's weaving. Not a relaxing hobby, but a necessity. You spin thread from flax or wool, measure, knot, and work the loom, producing textiles that range from functional to just good enough. The children help by getting in the way, unraveling things, or stealing bits of yarn to tie up their toy mud figurines. Water fetching is another beloved pastime. The nearest well is a walk away, and the jars are heavy even when empty. You balance them on your head or shoulders, walking with the grace of someone who's done this every day since childhood, dodging stray animals and slippery patches of ancient sewage. Speaking of sewage, there isn't any formal system. You dump waste in designated areas, hoping it doesn't make its way back into your drinking water. Baths are rare. When they happen, it's in a communal basin or the river, with company ranging from your neighbor's children to the occasional confused goat. Soap is a luxury. Cleanliness, therefore, is mostly aspirational. Pregnancy is another frequent guest in the household. With little in the way of medical knowledge, birth is a gamble. If you survive, and your baby does too, you're grateful, exhausted, and still expected to be up early the next morning grinding grain. There are no maternity leaves in Sumer. There's not even a word for maternity leave, just more chores. Interesting fact, in ancient Mesopotamia, women actually had more legal rights than you might expect. They could own property, run businesses, and even sue for divorce. But before you cheer, remember, these were options usually available to elite women, not the average mother of 7 who hasn't had a full night's sleep since the flood season of 1762 BCE. You'd think all this work would come with at least a thank you. Instead, society thanks you by writing laws that codify your responsibilities and punish you for falling short. The Code of Hammurabi includes plenty of lines about what wives can and can't do, like failing to produce children, disrespecting their husband, or committing adultery. The punishments vary wildly, from fines to drowning. Yes, drowning. Your children are everywhere. They help with small tasks, carrying water, picking dates, watching animals, but mostly they make noise. They bicker, mimic adults, get underfoot, and test your patience. They're barefoot, sticky with figs, and always hungry. There are no schools for most, no toys apart from rocks, and occasionally interesting bugs, and no hope of peace until they pass out in a heap at night. Older daughters help you. Younger sons chase chickens. Your eldest might already be betrothed, trading one chaos for another. It's a generational cycle of survival, noise, and trying not to spill the soup. Meals are communal and chaotic. Everyone eats together, often from the same dish, scooping with flatbread or fingers. Etiquette. Don't spill the stew. Don't insult the cook. And never ever eat more than your share of dried fish. It's a betrayal worthy of Babylonian drama. Your mother-in-law may live with you, offering advice that's both outdated and passive-aggressive. Your sister might drop by to gossip about temple priests and the neighbor's suspiciously quiet goat. Family is everywhere, comfort and curse in equal measure. Evenings bring a small sense of closure. The chores wind down, the fire pit is tended, and the children, finally, sleep. You sit in silence, weaving one last thread, or kneading tomorrow's bread, hoping the rats don't get to it first. Outside, the stars shimmer faintly above the mud rooftops, indifferent to your aching back and blistered hands. In moments like this, you wonder, is this civilization? The Sumerians would say yes. They wrote laws, farmed with irrigation, recorded grain sales on clay, and debated the movement of stars. But to you, civilization feels like 1,000 tasks, constant noise, and no clean water. Still, life goes on. You wake, you work, you sleep, if lucky. Tomorrow brings more grain to grind, more water to carry, more children to wrangle, and maybe, just maybe, a small moment of peace by the fire when the world finally quiets down. But don't rest yet. There's still religion to discuss, and oh, is it exhausting. The gods in ancient Mesopotamia were absolutely everywhere. They had a god for everything: sun, moon, war, writing, beer, and probably even stubbed toes. If you could name it, there was a divine force behind it. And if you couldn't name it, there was likely a secret, grumpy deity lurking in a corner somewhere, offended that you hadn't remembered them during your last offering. The skyline of your city, whether it's Uruk, or Babylon, wasn't shaped by palaces or shopping districts. No, it was the ziggurats that loomed above, massive tiered temples that looked a bit like someone tried to make a cake out of bricks and anxiety. These weren't just pretty places. They were divine offices, sacred staircases to the heavens, and local job creators for the priestly class. The priests ran the show. They were the original middle managers of the divine, highly respected, tightly scheduled, and often quite demanding. While kings had armies, priests had incense, omens, and the terrifying ability to declare that your slightly overcooked barley loaf was actually a sign of divine displeasure. Your average Mesopotamian day was steeped in religion. You didn't just worship on special occasions, you had daily duties. Burn a little incense, say a little prayer, offer a little grain. If you worked in the temple complex, whether as a cleaner, cook, or singer, your entire schedule revolved around keeping the gods comfortable. Because heaven forbid they get grumpy. Literally, festivals were frequent and long. There were sacred days dedicated to every major deity. Some involved parades with statues, others involved music, and some required animal sacrifices. Loud, messy, and very spiritual. On good days, it meant free beer. On bad days, it meant you were fasting and still had to walk in circles while holding a goat. Religion was not a spectator sport. You were always participating, willingly or otherwise. And it wasn't just about visible worship. The Mesopotamians were obsessed with omens. They believed the gods sent messages through stars, animal behavior, dreams, and the condition of sheep livers. Yes, you read that correctly. Liver divination, or haruspicy, was a highly respected priestly task. Special clay models of livers were used in training, complete with labeled lobes and divine meanings. A weird bump on the right side, Mars is angry. A wrinkle on the top, the king should probably not go outside this week. Interesting fact, we've found these clay liver models in archaeological digs, real educational tools, proving that ancient people took organ-based weather forecasting very seriously. The gods were moody and high maintenance. If your town had a flood, it wasn't bad luck. It was divine punishment. If your crops failed, you hadn't prayed hard enough. If your cow sneezed weirdly, well, better find a priest, fast. This kept everyone slightly nervous all the time. Priests were the experts in interpreting all these signs. They could tell you whether your dream about a one-eyed goat meant fortune or famine. They were also in charge of performing exorcisms, healing rituals, and calculating auspicious dates. But they weren't just spiritual guides. They were also accountants, historians, and scientists in their own right. Temples were the centers of not just religion, but economic life. They stored grain, employed craftsmen, ran schools, and even lent money. If you owed a debt, it was probably to a temple. If you had a job, it might be in a temple kitchen, grinding flour for sacred pancakes. Women served as temple personnel too. High priestesses held significant power, particularly in the earlier periods of Sumerian history. They performed important rites and were often from noble families. Of course, they were also expected to remain pure and devoted, which in practice meant long hours and not much laughter. Children were introduced to religion young. They learned the names of gods, the proper chants, and how not to offend the statue in the corner that always seemed to be watching. You might think today's world has a lot of religious rules, but Mesopotamia had them beat by a mile. There were dietary guidelines, festival protocols, and a long list of activities that could accidentally curse you. Interesting historical tidbit. The god Enki was believed to have created humans out of clay to relieve the gods of labor, essentially inventing the first divine delegation, which might explain why Mesopotamian humans were always working, always praying, and always hoping they didn't offend the wrong sky spirit. And yet, for all the stress, religion also offered comfort. There was a sense of cosmic order, a belief that everything, even the misery, was part of a divine plan. People took pride in their rituals, their temples, their sacred cities. They passed these practices down for generations, shaping one of the earliest recorded spiritual traditions in human history. As dusk falls and temple fires flicker, you might catch the distant hum of a hymn, a chant to Nana, the moon god, or to Ishtar, fierce and beautiful. You might not understand all the words, but the rhythm lulls you. Maybe tonight, your dreams will be good. Maybe the gods will smile. And if not, you've already made your offering, right? Let's leave the temple behind now. The incense is fading, and the priest is eyeing you like you tracked mud on sacred bricks. Our next stop, somewhere noisier, smellier, and even more confusing. School. So you've been chosen, or rather your parents have decided, that you'll attend the Edinburgh, the scribal school. Congratulations, future elite. You are now contractually obligated to spend the rest of your childhood in a room filled with dust, disappointment, and clay. First things first, not everyone gets this opportunity. Only boys from wealthier families, or those backed by powerful patrons, are allowed to attend. Girls, rare, but not unheard of. If a girl is particularly bright, or particularly rich, she might sneak into the scribe's path. But most of the time, she's fetching water while her brother scratches symbols onto mud tablets. Now, your uniform is simple. Linen, maybe some sandals if you're fancy. What matters is your toolkit, a reed stylus, a chunk of wet clay, and a back that's about to become very familiar with the business end of a stick. The school is not what you'd call welcoming. Picture a single hot room, packed with too many students, too few windows, and zero concepts of ventilation. The air smells like clay, sweat, and mild panic. The walls are bare, except for shelves stacked with old tablets, most of them broken, some of them suspiciously damp. Your first assignment, copy a proverb onto a tablet, something motivational, like, a student who neglects his work is a donkey. Encouraging. You try to carve the wedge-shaped cuneiform signs with your reed stylus, but clay is not forgiving. One twitch, and your loyalty becomes liver, and your teacher begins reaching for the disciplinary reed. Discipline is as regular as lunch. You forget a sign? Smack. You talk during lessons? Smack. You breathe too loudly while the headmaster is reciting from the Sumerian king list? Smack. The reed stick is not metaphorical. It's real, it's fast, and it's the school's second favorite teaching tool after sarcasm. What do you learn besides fear and improved reflexes? Writing, first and foremost. Thousands of cuneiform signs for different words, syllables, and numbers. You learn to write receipts, contracts, legal decrees, and grain inventories, all the glamorous building blocks of civilization. Math, too, because scribes keep track of everything from goats to moon cycles. Interesting fact, Mesopotamian math was base 60. That's right, 60. Why? No one's quite sure, but it's why we have 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle. So while you're being lectured about dividing sheep among villagers, you're also accidentally inventing trigonometry. Lunch break, such as it is, means a dry barley cake, some sour beer, and exactly 12 minutes of not being shouted at. Some students wander outside to stretch. Others huddle near the wall, muttering, "Don't let me become a scribe, please let me become a baker," under their breath. And yet, the Aduba remains popular, because becoming a scribe is the ancient Mesopotamian version of getting a job in tech. It's the key to a life of steady work, social status, and not having to dig irrigation ditches with a bent stick. Scribes are respected, feared, and occasionally listened to. They also get to sit indoors, a wildly underrated luxury in a climate where summer and pan-fried are synonyms. The classroom isn't only about writing. You also recite myths, epics, and moral lessons. You memorize the Epic of Gilgamesh, not because you love heroic bromances, but because someone decided it builds character. You learn the king lists, the rituals, the incantations. You chant them back in chorus until they seep into your dreams or nightmares. Your instructor is a bitter, brilliant man who once copied a temple ledger so perfectly he was offered a slightly better seat at the god's festival. He never lets you forget it. He walks with a stick, not just for discipline, but also because no chair in Mesopotamia has ever been ergonomically designed. Tests are brutal. You're handed a slab of clay and told to replicate an obscure tax treaty. You finish with cramping fingers and smeared wedges. If you do well, you get a grunt of approval. If not, back to writing, silence is the virtue of students 50 times until your stylus becomes a blur. Still, you start to understand. You begin to feel the rhythm of the language, the logic of the signs. You can write 25 baskets of barley delivered to the temple of Enlil on the 12th day of the month of Nisanu, without crying. Progress. Interesting fact, clay tablets were often reused. If a document wasn't sacred or permanent, they'd simply dry it halfway, wipe it clean, and start over. It's the Mesopotamian version of undo. Outside the classroom, your friends, if you have any left, are either farming, herding, or apprenticed to merchants. You feel slightly superior, but also vaguely haunted by the realization that you will never touch a sheep again without recording its weight, age, and marital status. Sometimes, a high priest visits the school to inspect your progress. He asks questions like, what is the proper phrasing for a grain inventory dated to the 3rd reign of the 4th dynasty? You answer correctly. He nods and leaves, taking the last hope of free time with him. Your nights are spent practicing symbols by torchlight, hoping your tablet doesn't crack mid-proverb. You start dreaming in cuneiform. You mumble phrases like, the fish market owes 2 sheep in your sleep. Your parents are proud. Your spine is less enthusiastic. And yet, there is a strange satisfaction. You can read what no one else can. You carry the words of kings, the lists of gods, the arguments of merchants. You know who owes whom how much barley and why. You are not merely a scribe. You are the memory of the city. Next, let's explore what happens when you're not one of the elite. When you're just another laborer outside the school walls. Because while scribes learn history, others are busy making it painfully. In ancient Mesopotamia, if you weren't hauling bricks for the ziggurat or bending over tablets in the scribal schoolroom, you were probably working a trade. You might have been a potter shaping clay under the relentless sun, or a blacksmith hammering copper into something functional, or, ideally, not flammable. Most people weren't royalty, priests, or slaves. They were the muddy, blistered, grumbling middle, the craftspeople and merchants who kept society running, and whose names, tragically, didn't get carved into any monuments. These were the underappreciated hands behind every temple, every amphora, every strange piece of cuneiform used to charge someone for a goat that had clearly seen better days. Your day began early, naturally. No one working a trade in Mesopotamia had the luxury of sleeping in. The sun rose hot and fast, and you had to make use of every tolerable moment before the bricks began to bake and the flies gained confidence. Blacksmiths worked with bellows and bronze in courtyards open to the wind, while potters spun their wheels and prayed the neighborhood dog didn't bump into them. Again, if you were a merchant, you might load up a donkey with jars of date wine or baskets of fish, both of which had distinct expiration concerns. Interesting fact, contracts existed even then. Clay tablets with neatly inscribed agreements covered everything from grain sales to marriage settlements. Some even included terms for loan repayment and late fees. Thou shalt return the ox by the full moon, or pay double in barley, was a phrase not uncommon to a Mesopotamian market deal. And heaven help you if your scribe had poor penmanship. Misreading a symbol could mean the difference between 5 jars and 50. Trade was no small affair. Despite the apparent chaos, Mesopotamia had an extensive trade network that stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the Levant in the west. Traders moved goods like lapis lazuli, timber, tin, and textiles by river, donkey, and foot, each journey more perilous than the last. Bandits, bad weather, or just bureaucrats with an appetite for inspection fees made commerce a kind of high-stakes gambling. You might get rich. You might end up explaining to a priest why someone else's goat is now sleeping in your yard. And let's not forget tools. Everything had to be made by hand. Need a shovel? Carve it? Need a cart? Build it? Need wheels? You'd better know someone who's good with wood and curses creatively. Craftspeople were respected for their skill, but that didn't mean they were wealthy. The more skilled you were, the more people relied on you, and the more you were expected to deliver without delay, payment, or lunch breaks. A bricklayer might construct the temple but never be allowed inside. A carpenter could build a palace door but sleep on a mat made from his own offcuts. The city was crowded with workers like you. Shoemakers, dye makers, weavers, brewers. It takes a village to maintain a ziggurat and supply the temple kitchens. Markets were packed with people selling vegetables, pots, fish, and prayers. Shouts filled the air, haggling, bragging, and the occasional donkey-related insult. This was the heart of the middle class. Not noble, not enslaved, just eternally busy. The middle class did have some perks. You weren't stuck laboring on royal construction crews, and you didn't owe your every breath to a temple deity, though you certainly made regular offerings just in case. You could earn, save, and maybe even invest in something, another goat, a cart, your child's education. And with luck and a favorable omen or two, you might slowly climb the dusty ladder toward relative stability. That said, the ladder was slippery and mostly made of mud. One bad harvest, one dispute, one poorly worded prayer, and you could tumble right into debt or servitude. Debt slavery was a thing. Couldn't pay your grain loan. Your neighbor's cousin might kindly offer you shelter and work, which quickly became indentured servitude. That's the Mesopotamian middle-class promise. Just enough rope to weave into a noose if you weren't careful. You weren't just working with your hands. You also had to navigate social obligations. That meant offering hospitality, attending festivals, and nodding respectfully at local officials who never seemed to be in a hurry to pay their artisans. If you were part of a guild or local craft circle, there might be some collective support, but also the expectation to contribute resources or labor when needed. It's hard to say no to someone holding a freshly forged sickle. Interesting fact, there were also temple workshops where skilled laborers, often semi-free individuals, produced goods for religious ceremonies and elite clients. These workshops could be massive operations, with hundreds of workers creating garments, statues, and ceremonial tools. If you were lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to be drafted into one, your days became a blur of incense smoke, shouted instructions, and highly judgmental overseers. Despite the toil, there was pride in craft. Even the smallest item, from a carved bead to a patterned rug, reflected generations of skill and cultural identity. You might never be mentioned in a royal inscription, but your handiwork could end up in a palace, or buried with a noble, and that's something. Your evenings were brief. After work, maybe a rinse with river water, a quick bite of bread or stew, and if the stars aligned, a brief rest. Leisure wasn't so much a concept as a mistake. Time not spent working was time spent preparing to work again. Tools had to be mended, trade goods prepared, and prayers said, loudly, if the gods had been particularly cranky. Transitioning out of this dusty, laborious world, what happens when your joints ache and your back gives out? What if you get sick? You'll want to keep your eyes open for what passes as ancient medicine. So let's step carefully toward the next chapter in this sleepy, muddy history, when you need healing, and leeches aren't even the weirdest treatment you're offered. In ancient Mesopotamia, getting sick wasn't just unfortunate, it was also suspicious. Every headache, every cough, every bout of stomach rebellion could mean you'd offended a god, walked too close to a cursed well, or simply made the mistake of being born. There was no separation between medicine and magic, and no clear distinction between doctor, priest, and concerned neighbor, with a dubious collection of animal bits. If you woke up feeling unwell in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, your day was about to get much, much worse. Let's say you've got a fever. Not uncommon. Maybe the water was bad. Maybe the air spirits were restless. First stop? The ASU, one of Mesopotamia's healers. This person might have some training, possibly even a tablet or two filled with ancient medicinal recipes. More likely, they're a blend of herbologist, hopeful amateur, and part-time diviner. The ASU would examine your symptoms, mutter a few incantations, and mix you a potion consisting of honey, crushed dates, and possibly powdered turtle shell. Then they might wave a burning reed over your head and call it a day. Interesting fact, Mesopotamians had over 600 medical texts inscribed in neat cuneiform, detailing treatments for everything from migraines to the evil eye. These tablets covered surgical procedures, herbal remedies, and diagnostic flowcharts that today's doctors would simultaneously admire and be very, very confused by. For example, if you had a toothache, one common treatment involved a poultice of crushed herbs, and sometimes prayer to a god of teeth, followed by spitting in a specific direction. And that's just the medical side. Most people would also consult an ashipu, a sort of magical priest responsible for detecting curses and soothing divine tempers. If you sneezed at the wrong moment or dreamed of snakes, the ashipu was your guy. He'd show up with a bundle of reeds, recite invocations from ancient texts, and instruct you to bury a fish under your threshold while facing the morning sun. You weren't just sick, you were spiritually compromised. Sometimes, ailments were blamed on demons, not metaphorical ones, real ones. These were malevolent spirits believed to sneak into your body and stir up trouble. The most famous was Lamashtu, a terrifying demoness who caused miscarriages and infant deaths. To protect a pregnant woman, families might hang protective amulets around her neck, or even post clay tablets near her bed, with threatening messages addressed directly to Lamashtu. Back off, or we'll invoke Enki, they'd scrawl in cuneiform, which was basically the ancient equivalent of a restraining order written in triangles. Medical instruments, when they existed, were simple and slightly terrifying. Bronze knives, reed catheters, clay jars. Surgery was rarely attempted, and mostly reserved for draining abscesses or removing splinters with dramatic flair. The general rule of thumb? If it hurts, smear something sticky on it, recite a chant, and hope for the best. Wound treatment involved honey and oil, both for their soothing properties and their relative availability. Burns were cooled with milk if you had it. Eye infections might get a rinse with beer. If your symptoms didn't improve, your diagnosis changed, from hot imbalance to possessed by spirit of the underworld. And yes, that meant more rituals, more herbs, and probably more frogs. Frogs were popular, not alive usually. Dried frog skin, frog tongues, frog feet, each had its place in Mesopotamian medicine. Mixed with garlic, onion, and the occasional bit of copper dust, they were applied to various ailments, especially those related to fertility or misfortune. No one knows how effective this was, but it certainly discouraged malingering. Childbirth was an especially dangerous time, both medically and spiritually. Women gave birth at home, often helped by midwives who also doubled as amateur ashipu. Incantations were spoken, charms were hung, and oils were rubbed on anything that seemed remotely important. Stillbirths and maternal deaths were tragically common, and many rituals were designed more to ease the soul's transition than to prevent the death itself. Interesting fact. Some Mesopotamian medical texts included extremely detailed surgical techniques, like draining abscesses with a bronze lancet or reducing dislocated joints with tension ropes. These practices were surprisingly advanced, considering the general tone of rub this frog on it and chant loudly. Still, the survival rate depended less on skill and more on whether the patient could withstand the aftercare or the infection. When all else failed, you became part of someone else's ritual. Death wasn't just an end, it was a problem. Spirits of the dead could linger, causing trouble for the living. So if your treatment failed and you passed on, your family had to make offerings, burn incense, and sometimes even hire a priest to speak with your ghost and convince it to move along. Funerary customs varied, but all included rituals to keep the recently deceased from becoming the recently annoying. Clay jars might hold your ashes or bones. A tablet might bear your name and the plea, stay quiet. And every so often, the living might revisit your resting place with food or wine, just to remind you you were loved, and also to please stay in the underworld. Transitioning from this world of clay, chants, and questionable ointments, there's one final inevitability in Mesopotamian life: death itself. But don't worry, even that had its rituals, its paperwork, and its mysterious underworld bureaucracy. Let's walk toward that slow ending, where your name might be remembered, or just smeared on a cracked tablet forgotten in a dusty temple drawer. Death, in ancient Mesopotamia, wasn't so much feared as it was reluctantly accepted, like taxes, bad porridge, and nosy priests. It came often, and it came early. If the floods didn't get you, the drought might. If disease didn't drag you down, an unpaid temple debt might tip things in the wrong direction. And through it all, people tried to prepare, not just for the end of life, but for what came after, which, by all ancient accounts, wasn't especially cheerful. Picture this. You're living in a mud brick house that leaks when it rains, cracks when it's dry, and smells like onion stew all year long. One morning you wake up coughing more than usual, the priest-physician's spell doesn't work, and the frog entrails weren't looking good. It's time. You're dying. The family sighs, not because they didn't love you, but because funerals mean clay paperwork and a lot of sweeping. Burial practices varied slightly by time and city-state, but the core process was fairly straightforward. You'd be wrapped in a reed mat, maybe a cloth if you were lucky, and placed either in a shallow grave, a brick vault beneath the home, or occasionally in a large jar if space was tight or you were particularly petite. This wasn't morbid, it was practical. Dead people belonged nearby, partly for ritual reasons, partly because graveyards were expensive, and mostly because the city gates closed at dusk. Grave goods were expected, not for decoration, but for function. You'd be sent off with bowls, tools, bits of bread, and if the family was feeling generous, a jar of beer. Not good beer. This was not the vintage stuff. This was more along the lines of slightly less fermented barley water. But hey, in the afterlife, you take what you can get. Some wealthier folks might get amulets, figurines, or a tiny tablet with their name, insurance against being forgotten, which was truly the worst thing imaginable. You see, Mesopotamians did not believe in a blissful afterlife filled with harps and clouds. No, their underworld, the land of no return, as it was poetically called, was a vast grey expanse of dust, darkness, and slow decay. You weren't tortured, but you weren't joyful either. You were simply there, forever, existing in a kind of endless, hungry silence. You ate clay, you drank shadows, you remembered things and slowly forgot yourself. And this, if you were lucky, because if your family didn't keep up with their ancestor duties, monthly offerings, quiet prayers, a snack at the altar now and then, you might not even get to drift around in gloomy obscurity. You'd be trapped, restless, a ghost, a giddim, as the Sumerians called it. A spirit without peace, forced to wander until someone remembered your name and gave you a crust of bread. Being a ghost in Mesopotamia wasn't glamorous. No chains, no eerie howls. You mostly caused minor inconveniences, bad dreams, spoiled grain, spoiled milk, occasional curses. You might cause someone to trip on their way to the market or forget their wife's cousin's birthday. Minor but persistent mischief. And still, most households feared these spirits immensely. It wasn't the drama, it was the guilt. Ghosts meant failure. Failure to honor, to remember, to care. This is why people took burial rituals seriously. Even the poorest tried to gather some token goods. A broken comb, a child's bead, a burnt offering. Something. Anything. And it wasn't just religious. It was personal. People wanted to be remembered because being forgotten was a second death. One with no rituals, no return, no reprieve. Priests played a large role in managing the dead. Some conducted ceremonies. Others performed exorcisms for those pesky, uninvited spirits. In major cities like Nippur or temple archives even recorded death lists, so long as you paid your fees, of course. If you didn't, well, you might still make the list. At the bottom, in smudged ink. Now, an interesting bit of trivia. In the city of Lagash, archaeologists found burial pits lined with broken pots and tiny tablets. These weren't graves for the elite. These were mass graves for the everyday, the ignored, the ones whose names were written once and never again. And yet, they were buried with care. Someone took the time to stack the bones, to arrange the shards, to mark something, however small. Another charming detail. Some people were buried with musical instruments, not because the underworld had great acoustics, but because music was a connection to memory, to story, to joy. Even in a land of dust and silence, maybe you could strum a tune, or at least pretend. The Babylonian poet Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon the Great and priestess of the moon god, wrote hymns that touched on the journey of the soul. She described it as both terrifying and beautiful. A path through darkness toward a kind of unity with the gods. Her poems, carved into tablets, are some of the oldest surviving literature in human history, and they offer a rare glimpse at how deeply people felt the weight of existence, and the hope that something, somehow, waited after. For the average person, though, hope was tempered by practicality. You might not reach divine unity. You might not join the ancestors. But if your daughter remembered your favorite bread, or your son whispered your name during festival season, that was enough. That was survival. Not of the body, that was ash, but of meaning. And so, the rituals continued. Clay figurines were buried with babies. Old men were wrapped with reeds. Wives lit oil lamps and spoke to the corner where grandmother rested in her jar. And all around, the city moved on. Because the living had to worry about taxes and floods and goat theft. But for a moment, a quiet, flickering, incense-sweetened moment, the dead were remembered. And that made all the difference. It's strange to think that in a world without antibiotics, without clocks, without clean water, people worried most about being remembered. But perhaps it's not so strange. Perhaps it's deeply human. To fear not just death, but erasure. To want someone someday to think of you and smile, even briefly, even while dodging temple fines and barley prices. And now, with the stars settling quietly above the Tigris, and the ziggurats casting long shadows over cities of silence, we leave the dead in peace. We let the grave goods stay packed. We let the clay tablets cool. And we move gently, softly, into the final part of this night's tale. Let the memories linger, just a little. Let the names rest, just enough. You are safe, you are warm, and the afterlife can wait while you sleep. So here we are, after a long, dusty walk through the cradle of civilization. You've trudged through the mud brick alleys. You've dodged temple taxes. You've tasted the grit of Mesopotamian bread and felt the ache of clay under your fingernails. And now it's time to admit it. You wouldn't have lasted. Not a week. Not even a Tuesday. Let's not sugarcoat it. Life in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't glamorous. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't even particularly clean. It was noisy, crowded, bureaucratic, and deeply, relentlessly practical. Forget your electric kettle and your memory foam mattress. There was no coffee, no weekends, and definitely no such thing as a casual afternoon. If you were lucky, you survived a few decades with most of your teeth and maybe one working knee. There were no antibiotics, no maternity leave, no plumbing. The streets were unpaved and the sidewalks were mostly theoretical. If you lived in a city like Uruk or Babylon, you were probably stepping around goat droppings on your way to haggle over onions. If you lived in a village, the highlight of your week might be a slightly less moldy barley loaf or an unusually quiet neighbor. The gods were loud, the priests were demanding, and the clay tablets? Endless. And yet, they endured. They didn't just survive, they created. These tired, blistered people managed to do something astonishing. They looked at the mess of their daily lives, the floods, the famine, the taxes, the temple chants, and the muddy sandals, and they built something permanent. They gave us the first written language, cuneiform, triangular impressions pressed into wet clay, baked under the sun or the stars. It wasn't easy to write. It wasn't even easy to learn, and yet they wrote. Receipts, contracts, hymns, medical spells, school exercises, laws about oxen and disobedient sons. They recorded it all. We read their voices now, thousands of years later, because they thought to preserve a world that seemed ordinary at the time. They developed cities, trade networks, canals, levees. They figured out how to divide time into 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours. They invented the wheel, but also bureaucratic nightmare scenarios that would make any DMV clerk proud. And through it all, they kept going, building, baking, bartering, and burying. The things that seem small to us now, a name etched into clay, a comb placed beside a body, a teacher scolding a scribe, were their monuments. And they lasted longer than empires. The laws they created influenced civilizations far beyond the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Hammurabi's code wasn't just about punishments, it was about responsibility, accountability, trying to make sense of chaos through a sense of order, however flawed. And flawed it was. But what human effort isn't? Their religion wasn't passive, it was a relationship. They feared their gods, yes, but they also negotiated with them, pleaded, argued, gave offerings and told stories. Gilgamesh wasn't just an epic. It was a reminder that life is short, that kings cry too, and that friendship might just be worth more than immortality. In a world where the river giveth and taketh away in equal measure, meaning had to be carved out, sometimes literally, from clay and prayer. And let's talk about their math. They weren't just counting sheep. They were calculating land plots, ration portions, and lunar calendars. Their base 60 number system still shapes our world every time you glance at a clock. They didn't have calculators or spreadsheets, but they had sharp minds and a lot of time to kill while the grain fermented. It was math by oil lamp, science by repetition, wisdom passed from teacher to student through calloused hands and brittle tablets. It's tempting to romanticize ancient worlds, to imagine Mesopotamia as a place of mystic chants and golden idols and quiet evenings by the ziggurat. But the truth was much messier. Civilization didn't arrive in a thunderclap. It crept in on sore feet, dragging a wheelbarrow of half-dried clay and muttering about overdue rent. It was a project, not a miracle, built daily, sustained stubbornly. And you, in your soft cotton pajamas, with your climate control and your dental care, you might have taken one look at that life and politely asked to go back to bed. The morning routine alone, waking to livestock sounds, eating dusty onions, trudging to a job where your boss is also your landlord, your priest, and your tax collector, would probably have sent you into a gentle existential crisis. But the people of Mesopotamia didn't have the option to quit. They kept going, kept building canals and scratching records into clay, kept watching the stars and arguing about barley prices, kept hoping that their children would have slightly less back pain than they did, and maybe, just maybe, that someone would remember them. They lived lives mostly unrecorded, mostly unremarkable, but entirely essential. The grand kings and conquerors made the headlines, but the farmers, the scribes, the potters, and the fish sellers kept the cities breathing. Civilization didn't rise because of statues and palaces. It rose because someone remembered to feed the goats, to mend the sandals, to deliver the bread before it spoiled, and someone else wrote it down. Even now, archaeologists sift through the layers of their world. Tablets buried under centuries, inscriptions lost in abandoned storehouses, the faint outlines of kitchens and workshops and latrines. They find bits of love letters, to-do lists, and complaint forms. And in these fragments, the world becomes familiar. These people laughed, prayed, worried, hoped. They had favorite meals and awkward neighbors. They got into debt and tried to get out of chores. They weren't just the first civilization. They were the first to document how hard and beautiful it is to try. And so tonight, as the imagined fires of a long crumbled city glow dimly behind your closed eyes, let yourself drift with that quiet legacy. You've walked the dusty streets of Ur. You've dodged priests with bad news and scribes with worse handwriting. You've watched the river flood and felt the slow, determined rhythm of a world inventing itself one barley loaf at a time. You wouldn't last. Not really. Not without sunscreen and running water and noise-cancelling headphones. But you don't need to. They lasted, they endured, and their world, full of dust and dreams, is still whispering through the ages. So now, let the ziggurats fade into silhouettes. Let the reed pens rest in the corner of a forgotten room. Let the tablets cool, the scribes sigh, and the goats settle down for the night. You are warm, you are safe, and the past can sleep, while you do too. Good night, traveller of clay and stars.